The importance of scale. Descriptive models tend to be single scale, but complex systems tend to be multiscale, and therefore big data, which comes from complex systems, is also often multiscale. Now, what do I mean by ordinary modeling or descriptive modeling is single scale? Well, we tend to think of models in some canonical form as the model plus the noise equals the data. So typically just a few model variables, and they tend to be smooth or differentiable functions. And the noise is what you use to explain why the data differs from the idealized model. Now, it's very important to remember that data is sampled from a process that can often produce even more data. Now, the set of all possible data sets that can be sampled from a process is known as the population. Modern data sets are so large, often they actually are the entire population or are considered to represent the entire population because they can be so large. For example, let's look at linear regression. We've got a data set and we want to model it with a straight line. So this is just a two-dimensional model. We have some points that clearly have some random variation but tend to lie along this line that you see drawn there. The x and the y are the variables corresponding to the axes. The m and the b for y equals mx plus b are the model parameters. And therefore the data, we would say, is y sub I. The y sub coordinate of the ith data point is m times x sub I plus b plus r sub I, where r sub I is the noise, or in this case we'll call them residuals. And the residuals are independent random values of some residual variable r. Now, Gauss showed that if capital R has a normal distribution, then this line is the best fit model for the data. So we're going to look at a histogram, and in this histogram we'll have bars, and the area of each bar represents the percentage of these residuals, these r sub I deviations from the line, that are between a number a and b. So when we say Gaussian distributed, we mean that the histogram of counts or percentages of where these r sub i's are looks like the bell curve. And if that's the case, then this line is the best fit model. Now, linear regression is on the scale of the x, the y, the m, and the b. All smaller scales are considered to be in the residuals and their noise or randomness, and no larger scales are considered. So descriptive modeling tends to hide scale. For example, the Earth-Moon or two-body problem is on the scale of thousands of miles for huge masses. Even perturbations are on the same or at most slightly smaller scales. We don't need to know the address of every person on Earth in order to solve the Earth-Moon two-body problem. So differentiability is what allows us to ignore scale, because if you have differentiability, then all smaller scales are modeled locally by a single linear transformation. So for instance, if we have a parabola and then we zoom in until the parabola locally looks like its tangent line at a point, then what we've done is essentially said we are only considering one scale, the scale of the parabola, with everything else ignored. But descriptive models are not enough. Consider that the Earth in mass is to a human as a human is to a protein. That's 6 times 10 to the 24th kilograms as opposed to approximately 6 times 10 to the 1st kilograms for humans, and 6 times 10 to the negative 23rd kilograms for proteins. So big data is often complex because questions at one scale require answers at another. And multiscale is not locally linear. So for instance, we have this fractal interpolation function which is continuous everywhere but differentiable nowhere. And what we mean by that is we have features at all scales. As we zoom in, we see not everything collapsing down to being approximately a straight line, but the same kind of pattern emerging over and over and over and again as you get to smaller and smaller and smaller scales. If we were to sample from this curve, a sample would be chaotic. So how do we model such things? Well, we tend to model using algorithms. For example, proteomics considers both the human and the protein scales simultaneously. Therefore, it requires models that span multiple scales, and you just can't do this with equations. Predictive modeling is where you use algorithms as models. In particular, algorithms which can be informed by multiscale big data in order to make predictions. Now, there's an optional video that you could watch if you'd like. It's not necessary, but you won't lose anything if you don't see it, but it'll give you some more insight into these ideas. So complex data comes from complex systems. And now let's say sort of rigorously what a complex system is. A complex system or process has many degrees of freedom, which means many independent variables, has chaotic and regular variables that are interacting nonlinearly. The sum of the parts is not the whole. It has an underlying topology or strain attractor that spans multiple scales, and by that we mean that there is some highly complicated underlying structure that spans multiple scales. And the three of these together gives a complex system the capacity to produce emergent behaviors, simple interactions on one scale that produce complex phenomena on another. This is a very important concept, this idea of emergence. Often big data is large because we need information at all scales, and that means we have to have massive amounts of data at the smallest possible scale. Because big data is often an attempt to study emergence. So for instance, a small scale would be genotype, a large scale would be phenotype, and we'd really like to know the connection between the two. How do the genes operating lead to the diseases and other features? A pathogen is on a small scale. It's just a virus or a bacterium, but it causes epidemics on a large scale. Individual agents working at smaller scales imply collective behaviors at larger scales. We see that with Twitter, recommender systems, Facebook, social networks, economic activity, videos going viral, things like that. These are large-scale outcomes due to small-scale individual communications. So how do you study emergence? Well, you have to have data sets large enough to reflect multiple scales. That's high volume. Data complex enough to allow emergent behaviors. That's high variety. Algorithms fast enough to produce answers. That's high velocity. Big data has information that can't be expressed as an equation involving regular variables. Descriptive models just aren't sufficient. So instead, our predictions will come from algorithms. And that leads us to this idea of data science. Data science is the use of algorithms as scientific models, as opposed to equations and the like as scientific models. We need models that can handle high volume, high variety, and high velocity, the 3 V's. So, big data is large and complex, and often that is because the data was produced by a multiscale complex process, and multiple scales require extensive amounts of data. So in summary, what is big data? Well, to study emergence, we have to have large data sets, high volume, large enough to reflect multiple scales, enough variety to allow emergence, that's high variety, and algorithms fast enough to produce answers, that's high velocity. The key here is that big data has information that can't be expressed in terms of equations with regular variables. Descriptive models are not going to work for us. We need algorithms that can cross multiple scales.